Shanghai. Good afternoon to those of you following us in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and good morning to our participants in the United States. A particular welcome to our panelists joining us from Washington, D.C. and from London. My name is Eric Bergloff. Since the beginning of September, I'm the Chief Economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB. You are all very welcome to join this webinar, which is part of a series organized jointly between the Center for Economic Policy Research, the LSE, and the AIIB. We have named this series the Global Commons Room because we want to discuss our common global challenges and how research across disciplines and across different parts of the world can help us make progress on addressing them. So today's topic is strong infrastructure governance for strong recovery. As you can imagine, having just joined a multilateral development bank focused on infrastructure, I'm particularly looking forward to this session. I don't think anyone questions the demand for infrastructure investment, not only to create jobs and spur recovery after COVID, but also to contribute to growth and resilience, particularly in emerging and developing economies, and to advance access to health, education, and economic opportunities. But we also need to upgrade infrastructure everywhere to manage the transition to a sustainable economy that is within the planetary boundaries. We hear a lot of numbers from around how much investment we need. The focus is almost always on volume, how much capacity and how much money will be required. There's much less discussion about quality of the different investment and what type of funding is required. Are we talking about grants, debt, or equity, or other intermediary forms of finance? And how should we allocate risk among the different stakeholders? Today, we're going to discuss a new book published by the International Monetary Fund that focuses on quality, how to ensure that we get our money's worth when we invest in infrastructure. The book is called Well Spent, and it has a number, or a large number actually, of chapters looking at the governance of infrastructure investments, very much from the government point of view. How are infrastructure investments planned? How are they allocated? How are they implemented? Of course, there's another related aspect of infrastructure governance, which has to do with how risk and return rights and control rights are allocated in the individual contracts. I will come back to that in a minute. But let me first say something more about the importance of the perspective that's taken in this book. You will hear these numbers later, but the authors estimate that a staggering 1/3 of all infrastructure investment is wasted. Through relatively straightforward measures, that efficiency gap could be cut in half. The book discusses the various tools for achieving this, and it explains the so-called Public Investment Management Assessment, PIMA tool, that the fund has been using since, I think, 2015 to evaluate the efficiency of the public sector investment programs. It has a very rich set of illustrated and educational examples from different parts of the world, both problem cases and success stories. Before bringing in the panelists, I want to pick up one thread in the book, and that is the role of the private sector. AIB is committed in its new corporate strategy to have at least 50% private sector projects. The main reason for bringing in the private sector is not really the lack of fiscal resources. Of course, that is often a driving force, but that cannot be the main reason why we want the private sector involved. Of course, there is these pressures on governments. Many of them are deeply indebted. The ability to mobilize resources domestically is limited. And so it's very tempting to say the private sector should fill the gap. But I think we need to have a very different perspective on why we bring in the private sector. The private sector is there to provide, sector skills and funds, and also to put pressures on governments to transform themselves and channel skills and experiences into other parts of government activities. It doesn't always work like that, and there are many examples in this book of how this can go wrong and how it can create liabilities or continued liabilities for governments for a very long time and make the fiscal situation more difficult in the long term. But I think it is important when we talk about private sector involvement that it's very much about transforming the state as much as it's about transforming the economy as a whole. So with those initial remarks, I wanted to say that we have a fantastic panel to discuss this book and the findings in it. Before we start the initial remarks, I just want to say a few words about the plan for the evening. We want to first have some introductory remarks from the panelists, and then we'll invite two students from the LSE, which is now a way that we try to run these webinars, and they will ask the first questions, and then we take questions from the rest of the audience. And Piroska Noich-Mohaji, who's taken over as director of the LSE Institute of Global Affairs, will handle the moderation of the question and answers. But before we go to the panelists, I wanted to put a couple of questions to you over the poll. John, can you put forward the... So, the question is, what should be a priority in tackling the problem of government inefficiency, corruption in emerging and developing economies? So this is to get a sense of what you think is important when we, before we get into the discussion. So we have, it's about improving transparency, it's about strengthening funding and management institutions. Is it about involving international organizations and NGOs? Improving government oversight and monitoring mechanisms? Is it to delegate to the private sector? Is it to adopt a strong and fiscal budgetary framework? And improving transparency is the leader by far. I would say more than half of the current respondents have indicated that. The second, the runner-up is improving government oversight and monitoring mechanisms. So it's the idea in both cases here that it's really about improving transparency, improving the way that the government has oversight and monitoring of projects. Okay, I think we have had the poll results, so I'm going to stop the poll now. And so 50% for improved transparency and second, but about a quarter is improving government oversight and monitoring mechanisms. So that's an interesting background to have for us as we go forward with this. So the first presenter here is Geneviève Verdier. She is one of the authors of this, works in the Fiscal Affairs Department in the IMF. And Geneviève, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Eric, for this nice introduction. Just an update. I am now in the Middle East and Central Asia department. Yes, spent many years in the Fiscal Affairs Department, where I'm very happy to have collaborated with my co-editors on this book. So good morning from DC, and thanks to our host for collaborating with us on this event. The topic today is infrastructure, strong infrastructure for a strong recovery. And because we have done recently this book, we thought it would be interesting to share the results with you. It's even of greater relevance in this pandemic context when public investment is being called to play an even a greater role in the recovery. I don't think I need to make the case for the fact that infrastructure investment is important. I was saying that I don't think I need to make the case for the fact that infrastructure investment is important, but the book does make that case. And the title of the book is Well Spent, How Strong Infrastructure Governance Can End Waste in Public Investment. So let me, oops, sorry, I'm trying to, here you go. So infrastructure is key to economic growth and sustainable development, and the needs are very, very high. In advanced, and this is across income levels, in advanced economies, it's needed to stimulate demand and for the recovery, and to address aging infrastructure. In emerging markets, it's needed to address large infrastructure bottlenecks. In low-income developing countries, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals need to be achieved very quickly by 2030. And the needs are extremely large. The world, it's estimated, various estimates, but they're always very large, that $100 trillion would be needed by 2040 to keep pace with the economic and demographic changes that we anticipate. Of course, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, investment needs are also very large. We estimate in the book that total annual investment needs, which you can see on the slide, are close to 3% annually for emerging market and middle-income countries, and about 10% for low-income developing countries. So how can these needs be met? Well, you can spend more, of course, but that requires finding resources. And the usual culprits are to find additional revenues. And of course, revenue mobilization is going to be important. But on average, low-income developing countries raise about 15% in tax revenue, 15% of GDP. Optimistically and ambitiously, perhaps they could raise that by a few percent, up to 5%. But that would not be sufficient, even if that can be done. Obviously, additional borrowing is possible, but even before the pandemic, global debt levels were at all-time high. Crowding in private investment is certainly an option, for example, in the form of public-partner partnerships. But as Eric was mentioning, the way in which that is done is crucial, and that always usually leads to some kind of fiscal risks and fiscal costs in the form of incentives, guarantees, or subsidies. And so spending better is important. So creating quality infrastructure, but that's been challenging. Almost all countries have some type of white elephants where the returns are not what they were promised. And what we find in the book is that on average, about 1/3 of resources are wasted in the process of public investment. That can be through corruption, through production delays and bad appraisal and bad selection of projects. In low-income countries, that loss can reach about over half. So why do many countries lose so much in the process of public investment? What prevents countries from doing well? There are many examples of poor project appraisal, faulty selection, grant seeking, and corruption, and we all link this to infrastructure governance. And by that we mean the institution and practices for planning, allocating, and implementing public investment. What we find in the book is that on average, better infrastructure governance could make up more than half of these observed efficiency losses. So how can countries build strong governance? The international community, many IFIs have long emphasized and offered sort of aspirational guidance on good practices in infrastructure governance. In the IMF ourselves since 2015, we launched the Public Investment Management Assessment, which is explicitly designed to provide practical policy advice to help countries assess their infrastructure governance institutions across 15 dimensions in the planning and implementation phases of planning, allocation, and implementation phases. So what we find from conducting dozens, over 60 of these in-country, in collaboration with authorities, is that the design of public investment management institution is generally stronger than their implementation, that the effectiveness of institution, there are problems at all levels of the public investment cycles, and that effectiveness can be improved across all income groups. And so using these schemas, we try to gather lessons from what we have done in these assessments, and across three sections of the book: infrastructure growth and development, fiscal policy for quality public investment, and the third part will really dig into practical solutions for building stronger institutions. And the book is available for download. So let me conclude by giving you two examples of institutions that are tackled in the book, which we find are very important for infrastructure governance. The first is, of course, corruption. And the costs of corruption are large. They include loss of public funds through misallocations or higher expenses and low quality infrastructure. This is because investment projects are large, they're long-term, they're complex, and this is all fertile grounds for corruption. Corruption takes many forms: kickback, collusion, fraud, embezzlement, extortion. And vulnerability to corruption is associated in countries with weak institutional capacities, which is what you can see on the right-hand side. The chapter goes through some red flags that could help detect corruption. That includes project selection, decision taken without feasibility studies and project appraisal, contracts with a single bidder without pre-qualification, et cetera. And the chapter goes through these examples. The last topic that I wanted to highlight was the importance of integrating climate adaptation and mitigation into infrastructure governance for greening the recovery, for example. We find that one of the chapters discusses how there's significant damage and disruption from climate change to infrastructure. For transport infrastructure alone, the expected annual damage is in billions of dollars, and this is what you see on the right-hand side. And the chapter argues that a holistic approach of infrastructure governance is needed to take into considerations of climate change, and that it might be needed to focus more on the upstream part of infrastructure governance. And what I mean by that is in the planning stages. That means having information about natural disasters and the impact of climate change, expected losses, documenting them and establishing climate-sensitive construction to make sure that the infrastructure is resilient, and many other items that the chapter lists. I think I'm out of time, and so I will end here by giving you some resources where you can find the book, which is free from download, and also mentioning that our fall fiscal monitor, that one of the flagship of the IMF, would also in the next couple of weeks take up the topic of public investment for the recovery. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Geneviève. That was, I think, a good summary of the book, and it also shows the many very practical recommendations that are in the book, for addressing corruption and also for thinking about how we can use infrastructure investment to really address some very important environmental and climate-related issues. So thank you, Geneviève. It's a good basis for discussion. So the first commentator, if you want, is Professor Tim Besley. He's the school professor of economics of political science and the Arthur Lewis Professor of Development Economics at the LSE. He has a long-standing research interest in infrastructure, but he's also very much involved in the practical aspects of infrastructure planning and sort of policy issues related to infrastructure as a member of the National Infrastructure Commission in the United Kingdom. So, Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. And let me begin by welcoming this book and this initiative by the IMF. I want to focus on what are hugely important issues that I sort of agree have been perhaps a little bit swept under the rug too much in discussions of infrastructure. So this is a big step in the right direction. Moreover, I think the timing is important too, given the challenge that was outlined there, the need to build a strong, inclusive and sustainable recovery for which infrastructure is absolutely front and center. So the timing couldn't be more apposite if we're going to have any chance on delivering on the challenges that we face. But equally, I think the book is slightly born out of a frustration that many have, and that frustration I would call a granular frustration, meaning that I don't think there's any one size fits all of this, either by sector or by country, meaning that you really do have to drill down into the country and institutional specifics before you can get a grip on the issues. So while there's a certain amount that can be said at a high level, so my own research on state capacity could use the term, well, we need to improve state capacity in the context of infrastructure delivery, but that's not a very helpful statement. What matters is how individual countries take ownership of the specific issues that they face and use those to create the kind of institutional and, I would say, cultural environment in which they can deliver on infrastructure. And that's what I'm going to spend a few minutes giving my own perspective on. But Eric mentioned that I'm a member of the National Infrastructure Commission, which I think can be cast, the creation of the Infrastructure Commission can be cast very much in the context of the UK government recognizing the institutional deficiencies in place for delivering infrastructure in the UK over a very long period. I was very struck. I chaired a panel at the LSE with one of our former, we call our finance minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has a rather grand name, and with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who had actually been previously a transport minister. And he mentioned that he opened a particularly significant roadway, a road extension during the period when he was Transport Secretary. And this was around the year 2000. And he said, I'm delighted to open this roadway. Harold Wilson would have been delighted. Well, for those of you who know British history would know Harold Wilson was Prime Minister in 1965. And yet the roadway didn't open until 2000. So we have had historically a serious problem of both strategy and delivery, and the Infrastructure Commission was created to recognize that. I think one interesting feature, and again, it goes to sort of granularity of institutional arrangements, is how our Infrastructure Commission has brought together different kinds of expertise. I sit on it as an economist, but there are civil engineers, people with private sector experience, people with expertise in telecoms. It's really important when you build an institution like this to get people to contribute from different perspectives, because it's rare that the problems can be cast in a way that any one group has a monopoly on wisdom. But the sort of shared wisdom you can create through an institution like that is I think, really important. So what would it mean to say, so I would say, although we're very much a work in progress in the UK, we did grasp the nettle. We decided to take ownership of some of the failings of government and to figure out ways to improve that. And I think the message has to be for each country to figure out its own particular set of issues that it has, and then to take ownership of those and to think about what institutional reforms are needed. And I like to think of decomposing the kind of governance issues into 4 subgroups: strategy, delivery, finance, and regulation. And all of them bring specific governance challenges. The National Infrastructure Commission is predominantly interested in strategy. Strategy is very important throughout the world. So I was in a meeting on Monday with our newly created, the LSE has set up in collaboration with the Rockefeller Foundation, a Fragile States Council. We had a session on Monday, one of our first meetings, on the need for low carbon energy sources. Now, it's very clear that the challenges of fragile states on delivering low carbon energy are very different from the kinds of challenges that might be faced in France or in Britain. But one thing was interesting is it needs to be strategic. There needs to be a vision of what the specific issues are and how you're going to deliver with those. And I do get worried too much that we go to some of the other kinds of failings before we have to ask the question, is there a strategy in place? Do we understand what that strategy is and who's responsible for delivering it? So for me, good infrastructure policy and good governance of infrastructure has to begin with strategy. And strategy is incredibly important to bringing the private sector in, by the way. One of the things we heard in the UK, and one of the reasons to set up the Infrastructure Commission, was the need to provide some clarity and certainty about where government policy is going. The private sector will not invest unless it gets that clarity. So for us, one of our recent challenges is, where are we going to go for low carbon heating sources? I think the answer is going to be, although it's far from clear at this point, towards hydrogen. But if we're going to persuade the private sector to buy into a hydrogen strategy, both building the network, delivering on the kind of innovation you need to deliver that network, there needs to be complete clarity at a suitable point by government that that's the direction of travel. So I begin, the first sort of failure and the first challenge of infrastructure governance is strategy. We can't spend all our time on strategy because the other parts are important too. So what's the next part is delivery. Delivery, I think, is well covered in the IMF's thinking and discussion. And again, each country has its own specific issues around delivery. One of the big choices being, what is the role of the private sector in delivery? Typically, in sort of bricks and mortar terms, the private sector is always involved. Namely, the private sector is the contractor. The bigger challenges of governance is, does the private sector then also play a role in the continuing delivery of infrastructure, and what would that imply? And in the UK, we've had very mixed experiences on that. There've been lots of challenges, for example, in having the private sector involved in franchises for the delivery of the railways, but rather a lot of success in having the private sector involved in ownership and management of energy and energy generation. So again, it's going to depend on the institutional context, the capacities of a given country to deliver that. But for me, big strategic questions is, what is the role for the private sector in that delivery, and how can you build the kind of legal and regulatory structure to make such a partnership effective? The third is finance, and I think for me, finance is integrally bound up with questions of governance. Eric will doubtless have his own view on this, and actually Peroska, who also worked at the EBRD. But what I saw when I did a review of EBRD was how closely involved EBRD is in governance issues through the way it was promoting transition in Eastern Europe. In other words, it's not just money, it's about fundamentally changing the governance structure associated with infrastructure delivery, not just infrastructure, but a wider range of lending in the EBRD's case to the private sector. It's absolutely essential in my view that we recognize that finance is bound up with policy-induced risk as well. If there's participation by independent financial institutions, it's often a good way to reduce policy-induced risk. I'm a big fan of national investment banks, that they're well managed, because they also help to manage governance and risk in the context of infrastructure finance. So I see finance as integrally bound up with the governance question. And finally, I'll just come a word or two on regulation. Pretty much any time you decide to have at least components of infrastructure delivered not directly under state control, there are big questions of how you regulate that infrastructure. Often the focus, again, depends on context, and granularity is important, but a lot of the focus is on things like pricing and maintenance, which is quite rightly something you have to regulate for. But one thing I've noticed, and the National Infrastructure Commission here in the UK wrote a report specifically on this that I was involved in, on how do you get regulation to work with the climate change agenda. In other words, how does traditionally regulation didn't have a lot of input into big strategic investment decisions. But if you're going to deliver, you need to get your regulators lined up with those kinds of ambitions. So again, regulation is a key part of governance. So just one final comment on the whole agenda of bringing in the private sector. One thing, again, I've been struck by sitting on the Infrastructure Commission is, in a way, it's not just, I think Eric characterized this great, it's not just about private finance. The kind of expertise and outlook and difference of view that you get by people who predominantly spent their time in the private sector, they tend to be on the whole much more frustrated with government than most of the people who spent most of their life understanding the pace at which government operates. But it's really important to realize that there is just a different cultural context for what is often traditional public sector operations compared to the culture of at least effective private sector operations. So I think we have to understand that that expertise can be very important in pushing forward both the quality of our projects, but also the timeliness of our projects. And I think I will end there, but with a final plea for the need to make sure that we do this on a granular country-specific basis, which I know the IMF understands, but that really means in the next phase of the work, turning it into a very granular strategy.
Thank you very much, Tim. And you know, I couldn't agree more on that last point that you made also at the beginning of your remarks. These infrastructure issues are very much country specific, and you need to have a very good understanding of the local environment and of what the challenges are. You gave many examples of that, and you also connected to the financing issue, and the finance is not only about funding, it's about governance, about control rights, and about how you create incentives and deal with risk in the project. So thank you very much for that. The next panelist is Abba Amro Salasi. He's the director of the African department at the IMF. He has been that since 2016. Before joining the IMF in a long time ago now, 94, he worked for the government of Ethiopia, and it's a great pleasure to have you on this panel, Abba. So please, the floor is yours. I should say also very importantly that he has his graduate studies from the London School of Economics.
Thank you, Eric, for that very nice introduction. Indeed, a long time ago since I was at the LSE, but good to be back, if only virtually. So thanks for inviting me to this panel. And I would like to offer a few thoughts on infrastructure, its importance, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also kind of how much more work needs to be done to get it right. So I will use my time to make 3-4 points. I think perhaps the first point I want to make is about the importance of infrastructure in the region I work on at the moment. Whereas in advanced countries it's about improving infrastructure to partly stimulate demand, to of course create jobs and the like. I cannot underscore how important infrastructure, the right kind of infrastructure, is in terms of the work in terms of advancing development in many developing countries, in many low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but really elsewhere. It's about how to knit together, parts of the country that are not integrated. It's about creating, expanding markets for rural households when you build a road. It's about increasing farm gate prices for those farmers who otherwise would have to rely on animal drawn carts and other means to get their goods to the market. So it is fundamentally something that has this huge transformative effect on people's lives. Anybody that's been to a village which didn't have a road and then eventually gets a road in rural parts of Africa and has seen the transformation that has brought. The first electricity pole that's introduced to a village in rural parts of Africa will understand kind of how transformative it is. All the kinds of businesses that can mushroom, the jobs that it facilitates. So infrastructure, whenever I think about it, that's what that's the importance that I attach to it, and why we at the IMF also recognize how important it is for countries to increase investment in infrastructure. Now, recently, post-COVID, and as debt levels in sub-Saharan Africa have been going up and fiscal space has narrowed, there's been some talk about maybe there's a need to scale back how much the emphasis on infrastructure. But I think, at least politically in the region, and really economically also, the importance of infrastructure is going to be there for many, many years, and it's going to something that's going to persist for a long time to come. So I just, it's a life and death issue in many country cases, the need for electricity. The other day we were discussing about, vaccines for COVID and how it needs to be rolled out. And if the vaccine that is going to be the solution for this awful disease that we are facing now is going to be something that requires cold storage. I mean, my heart goes out to people that are living in really rural areas where that cold storage is not possible because electrification has not reached those areas. So it is a life and death issue in many cases, and something which really is at the core of what development is about. Second point, and relatedly, given its importance, it is just awful that so much money is lost because of poor management practices, corruption, weak institutions, which the book and Genevieve's presentation very nicely brought out. I mean, to think that, from each infrastructure dollar that's spent in the region, up to 30% is being lost, just, tells you about how big the challenge is and how much work needs to be done. Now, the book and the blog and the material that we have at the IMF, we provide a lot of technical solutions on how to get the institutional framework, to improve the institutional framework, how to minimize these big losses. But I can't help but think that we also, beyond these technical solutions, also have to work on more political, getting the incentives, the political incentives right to get at reducing the losses that we see from infrastructure investment that happens in the region. And here I want to offer two suggestions. I think, again, these are both issues that both Genevieve and Professor Besley touched on. I think the first one is really how important transparency is in the procurement process in particular, but really all aspects of infrastructure implementation. I used to live in Uganda as funds res rep in the mid-2000s, and one of the big mysteries to me was why the cost of a kilometer of road in Uganda was so much higher than the numbers that neighboring Rwanda were reporting, Kenya was reporting, Tanzania was reporting, and Ethiopia was reporting. The Ugandans would say because the terrain is hilly, and I mean anybody who's been to either Rwanda or Ethiopia will tell you how hilly the terrain is. And what was worse was that this was, information I was privy to because I worked at the fund and could check the relative prices across these countries. But this information was not out in the public domain. CSOs, Parliament, accountability institutions do not have the ability to monitor and make sure that the prices that are being paid for roads are comparable across countries. There's a lot of masking of, these procurement contracts are secret, are commercially sensitive, etc., which I never really understood. I think, opening up these procurement processes, the cost of a kilometer of road, a kilowatt hour of megawatts of energy that's being procured, installed in a country to public scrutiny, publishing these contracts, I think would have a very, very salutary effect in improving accountability. So transparency, I think, has a really big role to play, including of international financial institutions. So whether it's the AIIB, EBRD, the World Bank, international financial institutions that are engaged in financing infrastructure projects should publish what the average cost of whatever type of infrastructure they're introducing is across the world, in particular regions. I think this would have a very nice effect of helping governments to benchmark the cost of production, but also the public to follow up and see if the costs are broadly right or not. Second issue, I think that's as important as transparency in my view, and it's a lesson I picked up at the LSE. I used to attend a course taught by Nick Stern, and he used to make this great point that that the fundamental development challenge is not so much about investing in infrastructure or human capital, but it is capturing the rate of return on all of these investments that governments make, and how that is really inherently linked, of course, to the social contract. I mean, there's a technical side of it about improving tax revenue authorities, about charging user fees, etc. But fundamentally, it's also about people's willingness to pay taxes, people's willingness to the strengthening of the social contract between government and the public. In sub-Saharan Africa, at least, what I've seen is a detachment between the provision of electricity, the provision of road services, building of bridges, and the cost of that, because one, tax revenue collection has not kept pace with all the investments that countries have been making in recent years. So there is a sense that and indeed, at the macro level, we do see debt levels having gone up, tax revenue not having gone up. So in a way, kind of people feel this infrastructure is free, and the government is able to provide it without cost. I think strengthening that link, showing, moving more and more towards, user fees at the cost of the provision of these services is also another way of strengthening political incentives for people to also monitor what the government is using their resources for. And that linkage between, I think, the cost of infrastructure and the infrastructure that people are using is also another way of, I think, changing the political incentives to make sure that money is being used a lot more efficiently. Last point I want to make is, particularly in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, how important the whole infrastructure issue is, and on a global scale, whether Africa gets its infrastructure investment right or not is going to have something that's going to be having a huge bearing, I think, huge spillovers on the rest of the world. Why do I say this? Population dynamics in sub-Saharan Africa are such that in 10 short years, by 2030, 1 in 2 entrants into the global labor force will be from sub-Saharan Africa. The demographic transition that's taking place there is so huge. The urbanization that's going to be taking place in sub-Saharan Africa, the demand for infrastructure goods and infrastructure services is going to be so huge. Getting this investment that countries are going to need to make right is really going to be so imperative, so important. Also, if it's going to be more and more brown energy that sub-Saharan African countries are introducing, that's going to have almost certainly going to have impact on climate change going forward. The more efficient, the more greener this infrastructure is. Of course, by the same token, it will also have a positive bearing on the global economy and the health of the planet. So it is an area of really global significance and global importance going forward, and also bears closer scrutiny. So let me stop my intervention here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and I think you made many points, but two that I really think we should keep in mind for the rest of the discussion. One is, of course, the transparency issue, and the second one, and I know Tim Besley has been working on this, it's the connection between quality of infrastructure and what people really get from the infrastructure and their willingness to pay taxes, to be part of funding or paying fees for using this infrastructure. I think that's a very important reason why we care about the quality of infrastructure. So now we're going to have a perspective from government. So we are very honored to have Tawfiq Hanafi. He's the Deputy Minister of Development Planning, actually in charge of development monitoring, evaluation and control at the Ministry of National Development Planning in Indonesia. So Mr. Minister, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric, for the introduction, and also thank you for inviting me. And good morning, America, and good evening, Asia, and good afternoon, UK. Yes, I think the infrastructure for Indonesia is very critical for development. I think, as mentioned in the book, I think a lot of area for many countries, important lesson learned, and also recommendation to improve efficiency of the public investment strategy. So for Indonesia, with a number of population 270 million peoples and archipelagic countries involving more than 75,000 islands, I mean the villages, 17,000 islands. I think it's, as mentioned by Professor Tim Besley, I think one size fits all policies becoming irrelevant for Indonesia, because each regions require specific, strategy to deal with providing the infrastructure. Allow me to share with you. Okay, here. Yeah. This is the strategy that the government of Indonesia is trying to, put in action in providing the basic services, including water and sanitation, and also the energy security and food security. And we also learn very important lessons, especially for infrastructure. Is not limited for connectivities like seaports and also roads, but what we learn, very important lesson, is also the digital infrastructure, because with a number of students, about 80 million, during the COVID pandemic, is very difficult to manage such huge student to provide the better and equitable access to quality education. So that's why the infrastructure is not limited in terms of roads and also connectivity in terms of like seaport, but also digital infrastructure becoming very, very important. That's why the government put a lot of investment now, how to make sure that students in the different island can have access to better education. As mentioned in by the books and also by the panelists, Indonesia also inviting private sector in providing the investment in infrastructure investment. So we use a different scheme to make sure that the involvement of the private sector is also available in providing different types of infrastructure. So as we can see here, we use like PPP and also different types of financing to make sure that the provision of infrastructure is also in place. It's very challenging to make sure how to invite the private sector also, interested in providing such important infrastructure. So as we can see here, a different type of infrastructure now is also involving the private sector, including in provision of water supply. And last year, we government of Indonesia, coordinated by the Ministry of Planning, working with the IMF, we conducted the public in PIMA assessment. So we learned very important lessons in the PIMA assessment in terms of the national and sectoral plans and project selection, project appraisal, and also portfolio management and oversight. So we also put in action plan. Now the government of Indonesia just finalized the annual plan for 2021. And the plan has been discussed with the parliament, and now it's been finalized. So in terms of the national and sectoral plans, we put a number of major projects in many areas, in tourism, in public and basic services like water and sanitation, roads. So we put major projects under the national sectoral plan. In terms of project selection, we also improving project selection and pipeline, because based on the assessment, lack of the project selection and in also a pipeline. So based on the major project will be based on multi-years budgeting. So it's also important development that the government of Indonesia put in place, put in action based on the PIMA assessment last year. Another area that we also learn is very important is a project appraisal. Yes, currently loan and grant project and PPP project has already consider technical feasibility and readiness criteria. But for a project funded by state budget, we lack of the, the project appraisal. So right now we already set the readiness criteria to make sure all the major projects funded by loan or the state budget, it should be fulfilling the readiness criteria. The last one is about the portfolio management and oversight, because monitoring and evaluation is very critical to make sure that all project has been planned and budgeted, it will be implemented as planned. So that's why we lack of the information at the project level. So right now we are improving the monitoring and evaluation mechanism. So we're going to strengthen the system to make sure that we're able to monitor and evaluate the progress of the project. So I want to highlight several key points, what we learn in providing the infrastructure. First, the governance is very important, especially in terms of the transparency. So that's why we involve non-state actors to participate in not only the oversight, we also invite from the planning process and also the implementation monitoring and evaluation. So we have many non-state actors participate to do the management and oversight. So the next issue is that because the need of the infrastructure for 270 million people, spread in many thousand islands is impossible if in providing the infrastructure is only based on the government intervention. So that's why we invite the private sector to involve in providing the infrastructure that also fulfilling the economics calculations. That's the very important. The last one, because the activities is also spread in many areas, especially at the village level with the number of over 75,000 villages. So I think it's also important to empower the at the community levels to make sure that they're able to identify what they need and identify what the strategy to deal with the specific issues in the local areas, and also want to make sure that they're able to manage and also to monitor the progress of the activities. I think I will stop here. Once again, I would like to congratulate the IMF for the publication of the excellent book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think you brought out very nicely the need to understand the specific challenges of individual countries. I had the pleasure at actually the first project that I had the chance to look at AIB was in Indonesia. So it was a satellite project to bring a public-private partnership actually to bring broadband to many of these islands.
Yes.
And it really shows how modern technology can address some of these real challenges that Indonesia is facing, and in terms of not having broadband penetration like some of the other ASEAN countries, but having huge demand. So thank you for giving that very detailed and interesting assessment of your own experience. So with that, the last panelist is Evelyn Hernandez. She, of course, comes here to shed light, not the least, on the issue of transparency. She's a part of the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, and she works a lot on engaging potential members in this program on creating transparency. She provides technical assistance and helps them in the design and implementation of various transparency programs. So, Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for the invite to participate in this panel. I would like to start my intervention by saying that at COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, we recognize what it is exposed in the book that related to the importance of infrastructure. We believe that infrastructure is crucial for development. We know that infrastructure provides the access to key services for the population. And moreover, we know that infrastructure is at the heart of the meet the sustainable development goals. And we know also that in order to achieve the goals, we need to invest more in water, sanitation, transportation, amongst others. And now my second point is about the COVID-19 pandemic, because it has exposed critical gaps in the healthcare systems everywhere. We know that the governments had to respond quickly, and this rapid response has shown vulnerabilities of using emergency procurement procedures to accelerate delivery of critical equipment, medicines, and temporary health facilities. The response has also, we think, compromised the principles of transparency, accountability, and participation. And now corruption risks, mismanagement, and inefficiencies are gaining space, resulting in less scrutiny of public spending. Just recently, we have been analyzing the assurance reports that our members are developing in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and we have identified that corruption risks are along the project cycle, life cycle, but specifically in project preparation and in tender management, we have found very issues of concern. Our colleagues at Transparency International had documented corruption vulnerabilities in public investments with serious implications and negative impacts on service delivery. Delia Ferreira has exposed just recently different corruption cases in the response to the pandemic. And my third point, and the last one, is about what the book is highlighting about the need of economic growth and the fight against corruption, and the need of stronger institutions and robust frameworks for delivering sustainable infrastructure. So in this context, for us, the pandemic represents at the same time a challenge, of course, but also an opportunity to support the different countries to implement diverse frameworks and supporting, in this sense, the infrastructure governance. For us, is really important. It's in our programs, in our members. We work in a multi-stakeholder approach, improving governance in infrastructure. At COST, we recommend the use of open data standards. We have developed one. It's called the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard. We think that using this standard, we can, by using it, we can maximize transparency, we can identify red flags more easily, and also we can introduce tools to track public investment throughout the project life cycle. The standard that we call shortly OC for IDS provides a guide to the government on what to disclose and how in the infrastructure investments. And we also work with civil society, media, academia, and private sector, developing capacities to use the data to monitor implementation, helping to ensure that the investments plans are guarded against corruption and waste. We trust that the dissemination of data and information with equal access for all the stakeholders can play a key role in successful oversight during the recovery. We have confidence in that civil society can support monitoring of public spending from planning to completion. And if we can have access to open data and analyze it independently, we can provide feedback and ask the right questions, keeping our governments accountable. So I will stop here with my third point and happy to respond to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think you are emphasizing something very important. It's not enough with transparency. You also need people to use that transparency to challenge what's being done by governments and by private sector actors and so on. So thank you very much for that. I now hand over the floor to Firouzka Nosh-Mohaji, who will do the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you everyone for bearing with us after a fascinating panel Unfortunately, we don't have too much time for questions, so I will try to keep an eye on time, and I'm asking our panelists to be short and focused in their answers. First, I'd like to invite two of our brilliant students, also they are students leaders under our Marian Forum initiative, John Gordon and then Avele Ayuho, to ask their question. John, please, first.
Hi, thank you, Piroshka. So my question was related to public procurement processes. Now, there's wide agreement that the most open and the most competitive those processes are, the better. There's a lot of common sense benefits from that. But at the same time, it makes a lot of sense for governments to want their public money to trickle down towards domestic industries, domestic firms, and ultimately towards domestic growth. And so my question to the panelists was, what do you recommend in this trade-off between the most competitive bidding processes and a preference for domestic contractors? What does the IMF recommend? You know, how does it happen in Indonesia, and what does COST recommend as well?
A fantastic question. Fantastic question. I will collect one also from Avele. Please come on, Avele.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So my question is kind of twofold. So on one end, we see that there has been a decline in private investment in areas that lack significant or strong infrastructure governance. But then on the other hand, we also see that in many of these areas that lack strong infrastructure governance, there's a lack of capacity to improve that governance. So my question is, what do we see, or if there is any opportunity for the private sector to get more involved in building this long-term strong infrastructure governance, not just when they are particularly invested in a specific project, but to actually be a part of that process long-term? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite, joining to our panel, some views on this. John specifically asked our IMF colleagues on their views on this trade of the most efficient, most transparent public procurement processes, but at the same time trying to get local content. Can I ask maybe Director Abba to tell us his experience in Africa or his views on this?
Thank you, Piroshka. I think particularly on the first question, this how to get this balance right, a really difficult question. We see it in many other areas, no? I mean, trade policy, etc. I have to say, as always, balance, striking a balance will be very important. Examples that I know of in some countries, for example, there was a very concerted effort in Uganda, again, by the government to try and link infrastructure investment being done by foreign companies, some part by foreign companies, and then also domestic manufacturing content. In Ethiopia, I know in the 90s there were strong efforts to pass knowledge from foreign construction companies to domestic ones. So there was an expectation that one side of a highway would be built by a foreign company, and then the other side by a domestic company. Mixed record, but I think this is. Something that's depending on the urgency of the project, with resources that are available, that governments will need to strike a balance around. Okay.
Excellent. Can I ask perhaps Minister Hanafi to try to address Avele's question on how to use the private sector in improving the government capacity to design and particularly to deliver? Is there any? If you were to name one silver bullet in the case of Indonesia, what would that be, Mr. Minister?
Yes, thank you very much. I think in Indonesia, first, we also have what we call the National Public Procurement Agency. So, it's independent. So you can put all your needs, and then the private sector can, apply to make sure that they want to fulfill what the government agency needs, send it to National Public Procurement Agency. Of course, the space, the room for the private sectors in participating in providing the public's infrastructure investment is also very huge. It's open. It's very open. So that's why we have the units of the National Public Procurement Agency. So they will review and also select based on including the economic criteria and also the quality criteria. So that's why I think the role of a private sector is very open, a huge room to participate in the activities conducted by the governments.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Now we turn to our general audience after students. And first, I'd like to call on Ehtisham Ahmad. He is now visiting professor at the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE, but of course a very well-known expert in general in public sector policies, transparency issues, and he's a former IMF colleague. Ehtisham, can you maybe come in with video or audio? Nadine, can we help Ehtisham to get access?
It seems like he's
not. Not a thing. Let's try that link, and until then, I ask our questions. If not, that I will read out what Ehtisham has sent in. A lot of very interesting, mostly political economic questions that are coming in addition to some technical ones. And the first one I'd like to address to Professor Tim Besley. That's from Juan Carlos Arlendi, asking this fundamental question of time inconsistency. Even if the government is not, it is well equipped, has the capacity, but does it has really the planning time horizon that is needed for very long-term investment decisions? And how can we help to overcome this time inconsistency problem? Tim, if you could come on.
Yeah. So, of course, the questioner is right that this is a fundamental thing which we're aware of. But if it was beyond us to fix this problem, we wouldn't be holding regular elections in the way that we do. Because one of the things we know about the costs of being a democracy with regular elections is we can't possibly commit to future policy. And the first thing, by the way, a government needs to do if it's going to make progress in this space is to recognize that government is a big part of the problem, not just the solution to the problem. And the way we design institutions is needed to anticipate some of this. Now, that doesn't mean we should dispense with regular elections. There are very good reasons to have them, but we need to find institutional fixes and arrangements that can extend the time horizon. And I would emphasize that the main role, and if I didn't emphasize this already, of the National Infrastructure Commission was precisely that, to prevent this incessant process of one government coming in and either repackaging or changing the policy of previous governments. That's a recipe for disaster. It's particularly a recipe when you want to bring in the private sector. If you talk to the private sector, the biggest problem they often have with dealing with government is precisely that the government can't commit to future policies, and they end up being burned because the government, a future government, reverses it. So I think the answer is there's no simple fix, but that the reason to build strategies which then hopefully you can build consensus around. So where we've seen the most successful examples of this is where, first of all, you get some good strategic long-term thinking, and then you build some consensus around that thinking to a point where it's very unlikely that will be unpicked by future governments. And that can have costs too. So in the UK, there was a big shift of consensus towards the balance between the public and the private. And all parties bought into that shift to a point where it's very hard to reverse that shift. Maybe we're in the process of reversing that shift now. So it's not like it always gets you to the best place, but I think you can overcome this problem.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so very much. I saw Etisham for a second on the screen. So can we see and get that question in the open?
Thank you, Piroshka. My question to the IMF, of course, what they say is absolutely important in the current context. What's missing is the strategic aspect, as Tim pointed out, and I would have liked to have seen a much more consistent approach to policy making, which is the use of shadow prices to address the shocks, to address climate change and the environment, to address income distribution. And in looking at this, you need to be consistent with different layers of government. And even though there are differences across countries, as Tim pointed out, the issues across levels of government are similar. Can you apply consistent evaluation criteria across levels of government? And that then in a pandemic leads to the question, firstly, do you maintain subnational fiscal rules at the subnational level? And secondly, what do you do in terms of monitoring liabilities that are built up, particularly with public-private partnerships? In a sense, that's a governance question that the IMF is addressing, but in my view, not sufficiently to look at recording liabilities in subnational balance sheets, which to me is a little surprising because the IMF has recommended quite a lot the use of consistent balance sheets, and it seems to me that a precondition for transparency is to have that in place. So really, it's a policy issues, fiscal rules, and the PFM side leading to consistent balance sheets.
Thank you very much, Etisham. This is almost like a group of questions. So I'd like to ask Tim, as well as perhaps Minister Hanafi and Genevieve to try to address at least one of the sub-questions of this important set of questions. Tim, would you like to go first? Using shadow prices and how widespread this is and how useful also for COVID crisis responses. I think we don't have Tim, so can I turn to Minister Hanafi to ask whether sort of this approach using shadow prices is applied at at different levels of government, as Etisham is asking. Mr. Minister.
Yes, actually, I'd like to respond on the monitoring the implementation at the local level.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think it's important that we have a clear deliverable outputs for each investment. So that's we can use that as the basis to monitor the output of the investment. So that's what we doing, because actually we give the authority to the local government to manage the implementation of the investment. But we need to make sure that we have a clear deliverable outputs that we can use to monitor the output and also even the impacts of the investment. I think that's what I want to.
Thank you very much, Minister. I very much appreciate it, and it's a very important aspect of any good strategy and implementation. Do we have Tim by any chance? If not,
yeah.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Tim. So use of shadow pricing, no problem whatsoever. But we'd love to your wisdom and how widespread is it actually in your commissions and in general in assessing projects.
So, I mean, I think project appraisal is hugely important. Etcham's completely right about that. but I do worry it invites a kind of managerialism which has its limitations, and I've seen that in action. I mean, a couple of examples are when you're trying to generate really transformational change. Project appraisal tends to do a very poor job at picking out where you should go. I mean, there's a classic example in the UK was the creation of Canary Wharf. For those who don't know, that's basically when the City of London moved to the east. It was looked at by all manner of project appraisal and thought to be a basically negative return prospect, because project appraisal was simply incapable of envisioning the kind of transformational change. The politicians pushed it through in spite of the fact that everybody who did the project appraisal said it was a bad idea. Private sector businesses actually went bankrupt developing Canary Wharf, so it looked all along. But now everyone would say it's one of the most remarkable transformational projects that's been undertaken, probably anywhere in the UK and probably high on the list in Europe. And so I think we have to acknowledge there are real limitations. And I think I worry about that in the climate change context, because what we're talking about are transforming lifestyles in many different ways. And you know, while it's true we can put carbon prices and other things to try and pick that up, I do think it's a limited tool, and it will not do the job in really giving us the kind of guidance we need.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to other questions from the audience. There is a lot of understandable doubt and concern about government transparency and whether we can trust government who is overseeing transparency overall, and whether we can trust the data that government produces at all. And that's a question from Piriam Verma, but very nicely related to that, Jintao Zhu from the LSE, one of our other brilliant LSE students, is asking kind of the broader question. What political incentives are there to incentivize more transparency for the government? What are the political incentives? And this is a question I'd like to actually pose to all the panel. If you were to pick one, obviously we have talked about a lot of very important institutional aspects, but specifically political incentives. What would you say are the most important to ensure transparency? And I have to say, while you're thinking about the answer, that I was a little bit taken aback by our polling results. To give the NGOs and IFIs only 7% out of the 100% answers on importance of do I recall it? Okay, it's 5%. Sorry, 5% only. Giving a role in improving government inefficiency and transparency to two important outside actors who can help, both from international organizations, from the EBR, the AIIB, as we have mentioned, Tim has kindly mentioned, and from the NGOs. We saw collectively only 5% that would think that that's important. So recalling that, what are the how should we provide better political incentives to have transparency over government? And I would like to go around the panel. We don't have too much time, but I think this is a really important question. Can I ask perhaps first Mr. Hanafi?
I think it's, transparency is very important. And because transparency will lead to the citizen engagement for the development programs. And that's why we also have a website under Ministry of Finance about the disbursement for the budget allocation. So citizens and also non-state actors can use the information to monitor the implementation of the program. So I also attended a number of meetings involving the non-state actors, and they also appreciate about the openness of the information. So that's, I think, what I want to emphasize. The transparency is very critical to make sure that citizen engagement is also can be realized, the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Evelyn, you representing the NGO sector here. And you described a number of important initiatives to hold all the key stakeholders in the process accountable. For you, what is the most important obstacle that you see in your everyday work in getting the open access that you would like to have to do even a better job?
Yeah, I think the challenge that we face initially is the capacities and processes inside the procuring entities. We need to work very closely with the government officials in order to help them to understand the quality of data. They need to put in place really a data that we can use in order to analyze and provide this feedback for the decision-making process to improve the investments and to improve also trust. If we work together, civil society, private sector, and government, this trust can be developed, but we need to secure that public officials really understand why they are disclosing data, why is that important that this is a quality of data.
Excellent. Can I call on our director from the IMF, Abba, particularly based on your experience, also as a RESREP, you have your on-the-ground experience in this regard.
So thank you, Piroshka. This is exactly the point I was trying to get at earlier about the social contract, and I think, frankly, you know, much as debt, borrowing from the public is one of the things that accounts for greater and greater democratization over, you know, if there's one central lesson from history, running out of fiscal space, not being able to finance infrastructure going forward simply via borrowing, but rather needing to pay for it through taxes, is going to compel governments, I think, to be more public about how effectively they're using resources. So I wouldn't underestimate the importance of you know, public pressure, running out of fiscal space and needing to borrow.
Excellent. And finally, Tim.
Well, I am going to give a very similar answer. If you look over human history over the last 200 years, I'm a big fan of Margaret Levy's book called Of Rule and Revenue. And her basic point is we would not have made the transformative state changes that we've made had it not been because citizens have to be informed and buy into what the state can deliver. And you can't raise revenue without voluntary compliance. I mean, you can try and beat as much revenue out of your citizens as you want, but we know that there are huge limits to that. And in order to run a modern state of the kind, say, we see in Western Europe, you need between 30 and probably more than 40% of GDP to be raised in the form of taxation. You simply can't achieve that unless you have an open, transparent state. We know that. And ultimately, if the aspiration of any part of the world is to emulate those successful states, they will have to go through a transition path that acknowledges that that's the only way forward. We see no alternative model out there that has been successful in sustaining well-being through operation of the state. If you think of what the Scandinavian countries deliver to their citizens and how they deliver it, it's ultimately by being open and transparent with their citizens about what they do. And if people don't grasp that message, unfortunately, they're on a total misapprehension about the long-run success of the places they're trying to manage.
Thank you so much. This, I think, provides a very nice closing to a very rich discussion. Unfortunately, our time is up, and many questions have been left unanswered. I have two good news. One, you know, there is the book. And please buy the IMF book, which is free. So the knowledge and wisdom is there. We will also show, after we close this panel in a minute, a short video by IMF colleagues highlighting of the key messages even once more. And we will follow up with specific questions. Some of them were technical, and we don't have, unfortunate, time for that. We will follow up on the questions individually as well. And before thanking everybody, I'd like to say also that we will be back in a week's time, and we will be looking at, in this series, we will be looking at how to reform global institutions, particularly WTO, which is under so much pressure for doing so. So with that, I would like deeply thank all our panelists today, our IMF colleagues for having put out what Tim said, an extremely timely and a very important book subject matter. So thank you for that. Thank you for all the panelists. And if you have time, stay with us to watch this video for a few minutes. Thank you.
Spending well on infrastructure investment is more important now than ever before. Public investment is important for fostering inclusive economic growth and development. And as countries recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, it will be essential that they invest their limited resources in resilient, green, and quality infrastructure. Infrastructure, schools, hospitals, transportation, energy, and other public services are essential to a country's productivity and prosperity. Governments must manage infrastructure well and make sure it is resilient against pandemics, natural disasters, and climate change. This requires strong infrastructure governance, where a country plans, allocates, and implements infrastructure spending in a sustainable or quality manner. But IMF analysis shows that on average, countries lose over 1/3 of potential public investment returns due to weak infrastructure governance. To help countries get the most out of infrastructure spending and reduce inefficiencies and waste, the IMF has published a book outlining good practices in infrastructure governance for policymakers, donors, and academics. The book shows how strong infrastructure governance can help achieve sustained growth and meet the Sustainable Development Goals, or how more than 60 countries have benefited from the IMF's Public Investment Management Assessment Tool to help strengthen their infrastructure governance. Learn what countries with limited fiscal space can do to address infrastructure bottlenecks and spend well with limited resources, and how strong infrastructure governance can help reduce corruption, manage fiscal risks, improve planning, selection and maintenance of projects, and address climate change resilience. The IMF and the international community are committed to helping countries spend well and reduce waste in public investment. To learn more, please visit imf.org/public investment.